24 hours before this earthquake struck Vanuatu, a magnitude 7.7 tore through Indonesia and killed dozens of people. 2 major earthquakes, 2 different countries, 1 single day on the Pacific Ring of Fire. And in Vanuatu, this wasn't the first warning. In December 2024, an earthquake here knocked the country's main hospital out of action at the exact moment it was needed most. Now, less than 2 years later, the ground beneath this island chain has moved again. This time, almost nobody outside the region even noticed. And the reason why is the key to understanding everything else in this story. Because Vanuatu isn't just unlucky. It sits on top of one of the fastest moving, most consistently active plate boundaries on the planet, a place where major earthquakes aren't rare events. They're a matter of routine. What happened today and what happened in 2024 are 2 faces of the exact same geological system. Understanding the difference between them is the difference between a headline that disappears in a day and one that changes a country. There's a reason this particular fault produces so many earthquakes, while others stay quiet for decades. It comes down to how fast the plates are actually moving relative to each other, and how much strain that motion builds up before something finally gives. Vanuatu's subduction zone doesn't get long, quiet gaps between major events. It gets short ones, which is part of why its earthquake record reads less like a list of rare disasters and more like an ongoing pattern. Here's what actually happened. At 3:20 a.m. UTC on August 16, 2026, a magnitude 6.1 earthquake struck northeast of Port-Olry, a small coastal village on Espiritu Santo, Vanuatu's largest island. Roughly 145,000, the U.S. Geological Survey issued its lowest alert level, green, meaning a low likelihood of casualties or damage. No tsunami warning followed. Port-Olry itself is tiny, home to just under 2,000 people on the northeastern coast of Espiritu Santo. It's not the capital. It's not even the region's largest town. That title belongs to Luganville, over 100 kilometers away. Vanuatu's actual capital, Port Vila, sits more than 370 kilometers to the south. But distance from a city doesn't mean distance from danger, because the fault running beneath this entire island chain doesn't care where the population centers are. It runs the full length of the archipelago, and every community sitting above it, remote, village, or capital city, shares the same underlying risk. For an earthquake this size, that outcome is unusual. A magnitude 6.1 releases an enormous amount of energy, roughly equivalent to 21 kilotons of TNT. That's total energy released at the source, not a measure of what actually reaches the surface. Under different circumstances, an earthquake carrying that much energy, closer to the surface and closer to people, could cause serious damage. This one didn't, so why didn't it? The answer is one number: depth. This earthquake happened 188 kilometers underground, and that single detail changes everything about how it reached the surface. To understand why, you need to understand what's actually happening beneath Vanuatu. This island chain exists because of a battle that never stops, playing out entirely out of sight, hundreds of kilometers beneath the water. It sits above the new Hebrides subduction zone, a boundary where the Australian tectonic plate is being forced downward and eastward, sliding beneath the Pacific plate. Subduction zones like this exist all along the Ring of Fire, from Japan to Chile to the Pacific Northwest. What sets this one apart is speed. The Australian plate is diving beneath Vanuatu at somewhere between 90 and 100 millimeters a year. California's San Andreas Fault, one of the most closely watched fault lines on Earth, moves at roughly a third of that rate. Vanuatu's plate boundary has been grinding downward at this pace for millions of years, and all of that motion has to go somewhere. It builds as stress locked in the rock, accumulating year after year with nowhere to release. Eventually, that stress breaks loose as an earthquake, sometimes small, sometimes not. As the Australian plate descends, it doesn't slide down smoothly. It plunges to depths of over 600 kilometers, one of the deepest subducting slabs anywhere on the planet. Picture a cold, rigid sheet of rock being forced down into hot, softer material beneath it. It doesn't bend gracefully, it cracks internally as it goes, fracturing under pressures most materials on the surface never experience. That cracking generates earthquakes at nearly every depth along the way, from just beneath the seafloor to hundreds of kilometers down. Today's quake happened deep inside that descending slab. Geologists call this an intraslab earthquake, a rupture within the plate itself, not at the boundary where two plates grind directly against each other. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story because it's the single factor separating a quake nobody notices from one that reshapes a country. Here's the simplest way to picture it. Drop a stone in a pond right next to your feet, and you feel the splash immediately. Drop the same stone into the middle of a lake, and by the time any ripple reaches the shore, it's spread out and lost most of its force. Today's earthquake happened in the middle of the lake. The energy was real, But it had nearly 200 kilometers of rock to travel through before reaching anyone standing on the surface. And by then, it had weakened considerably. Now picture the opposite. A rupture at the interface where the two plates are locked directly against each other, just 10, 20, maybe 50 kilometers down. That energy has almost nowhere to go before it hits the surface. It arrives concentrated, sharp, violent. No 200 kilometers of rock to absorb it, no time for it to spread thin. Just raw force arriving directly beneath homes, roads, and hospitals. That's exactly what happened on December 17th, 2024. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck near Port Vila, Vanuatu's capital, at a depth of roughly 54 kilometers, shallow enough to hit with full force. Around 80,000 people were affected, 14 people were killed, roughly 200 were injured. Total damage reached $231.7 million, in a country with an annual GDP of about $1 billion. In under a minute of shaking, Vanuatu lost close to a quarter of its entire yearly economic output, damage that would take most nations years to absorb, let alone one spread across dozens of remote islands. The country's main referral hospital in Port Vila was itself damaged. Its operating theater went offline in the exact moment emergency surgeries were needed most, forcing medical staff to treat the injured in triage tents, outside a building that could no longer safely function. Search and rescue crews worked through roads blocked by landslides, cut off from communities that needed help most urgently. More than 300 aftershocks followed in the weeks after, the strongest reaching magnitude 6.1, just days later, each one a fresh threat to buildings already weakened by the main shock. Survivors described the ground shaking for nearly 40 seconds. Count that out. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now imagine the floor beneath you, the walls around you, and the ceiling above you, all moving the entire time, with no clear moment to know when it will stop. That's what people in Port Vila lived through in a country where much of the building stock, though resilient in places, was never engineered to withstand shaking of that intensity. That's what this fault system is capable of when the rupture happens close to the surface. Not a distant tremor felt as a gentle sway 200 kilometers away, but a direct hit, arriving with almost none of its force lost along the way. And Vanuatu's history with this fault goes back much further than 2024. In late December 1973 and early January 1974, two separate earthquakes above magnitude 7 struck within weeks of each other in nearly the same region as today's epicenter. Two major ruptures, in the same corner of the same island chain, less than a month apart. The strongest earthquake ever recorded along this stretch of the new Hebrides arc reached magnitude 7.9. Since 1900, this area alone has produced at least 14 earthquakes above magnitude 7. And since 2009, this arc has generated a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake in nearly every single year, a frequency few places on Earth can match. This isn't a run of bad luck. It's the normal behavior of this fault system, a rhythm that has repeated for as long as records have existed here. To put the scale of that in perspective, seismologists measure earthquake energy on a logarithmic scale, meaning each whole number increase represents roughly 32 times more energy released, not just a little more. A magnitude 7.9 doesn't look dramatically bigger than a 6.1 on a chart, one extra digit, a slightly longer bar in a graphic. But in terms of raw destructive potential, the gap between them isn't small. It's thousands of times more energy, released in a fraction of a minute. None of that means Vanuatu's next major earthquake is imminent. Earthquake prediction, in the sense of naming a date, does not exist. No fault on Earth, no matter how well studied, no matter how many sensors are watching it, gives scientists that kind of certainty. What seismologists can say with confidence, based on more than a century of recorded activity here, is that this subduction zone remains fully capable of producing earthquakes on the scale of 2024, or larger. That's not a prophecy. It's a description of what this fault has already proven it can do, repeatedly, across generations, long before anyone was tracking it with modern instruments. There's another layer to this. The process generating these earthquakes also powers Vanuatu's volcanoes. As the Australian plate descends and heats under enormous pressure, it releases water and other compounds into the mantle above it, lowering the melting point of the surrounding rock and feeding magma chambers like the one beneath Mount Yasur on Tanna Island, which has been erupting almost continuously for centuries and remains one of the most accessible active volcanoes on Earth. Different hazard on the surface, one underlying cause hundreds of kilometers below it. Now, about the timing with Indonesia. On the same day this quake struck near Port-Olry, a magnitude 7.7 devastated Flores Island in Indonesia, with a separate magnitude 6.9 recorded near Sumatra. It's natural to wonder if these events are connected. They almost certainly are not, at least not directly. These are separate plate boundary systems, thousands of kilometers apart, each driven by its own local stresses and history, each with a fault geometry and stress buildup that has nothing to do with the other. There is no credible mechanism for an earthquake in Indonesia to trigger a rupture in Vanuatu across that kind of distance. What connects these two events isn't cause and effect, it's geography. The Ring of Fire is one continuous belt of plate boundaries wrapping almost entirely around the Pacific Ocean, responsible for roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes and most of its active volcanoes. On any given day, multiple sections of that belt can be active simultaneously, entirely independent of one another, simply because so much of the planet's tectonic activity is concentrated along this one ring. Two major earthquakes on the same day, thousands of kilometers apart, isn't a sign that something unusual is building underground. It's closer to a coincidence of timing, along a boundary that's essentially always active somewhere, on any given week, in any given year. Since 2024, help has arrived. Australia alone contributed roughly $28 million in humanitarian and recovery assistance with additional support from regional partners across the Pacific. Engineers have assessed damaged buildings, marking which ones are safe to re-enter and which need to come down entirely. Reconstruction is ongoing, school by school, clinic by clinic, but rebuilding takes years in a nation of roughly 334,000 people, spread across more than 80 islands, many mountainous, many connected only by limited roads or infrequent boats. Much of the country's construction remains informal, built without the kind of seismic engineering that could make the difference in a shallow, high-magnitude event. Timber frame buildings, when properly engineered, can actually flex and absorb shaking reasonably well, but informal construction, built quickly and without that engineering behind it, doesn't carry that same resilience. Every dollar spent recovering from the last earthquake is a dollar not yet spent preparing for the next one, whenever it comes. Today, the ground moved again beneath Vanuatu, and almost nobody was hurt. Not because the danger has passed, because of where, 188 kilometers down, the rupture happened to occur. That's the reality this nation lives with. The fault that shook gently today produced a catastrophe in 2024, and multiple magnitude 7+ earthquakes in the decades before that. And it will keep producing earthquakes for as long as the Australian plate continues its slow, grinding descent beneath the Pacific, which is to say, for millions of years still to come. Scientists can't tell you when the next major shallow rupture will happen. What the historical record makes clear is that the fault capable of producing one has never gone away. And the people who live above it know that better than anyone. They've rebuilt after earthquakes, after cyclones, after volcanic ash falls, and they'll rebuild again. Not because the danger has passed, but because it's the only choice a nation living on top of one of the most active subduction zones on Earth has ever really had. Resilience here isn't a slogan, it's a routine, practiced again and again, because the ground beneath these islands has never once given them the option to stop. In Vanuatu, the difference between a quiet news day and a national emergency was never a matter of if this fault would move. It's a matter of how deep and how close to the surface the next rupture happens to break. If you want to understand the next major earthquake before the headlines catch up, subscribe, and I'll break it down the moment it happens.